Jacob Thorne's blood ran cold as he watched his new housekeeper's eyes linger on the wanted poster bearing his face and name. Her next decision would determine whether he'd see another sunrise or hang before sunset. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Under the vast, unforgiving sky of the Montana Territory, Jacob Thorne's ranch stood like a stubborn declaration against the wilderness. The main house, built of rough-hewn logs that had weathered 15 harsh winters, seemed to grow from the earth itself, a testament to one man's determination to carve something permanent from a land that resisted permanence. The last rays of autumn sunlight stretched across the porch as Jacob dismounted his stallion, his bones aching from the long ride into town. The lonely creak of the door echoed through the empty house. Once, the sound of laughter and movement had filled these rooms. Now only dust motes danced in the shafts of dying light. Jacob hung his hat on the peg by the door, his calloused fingers lingering on the worn brim. 5 months since Mary had passed, 5 months of coming home to silence. He struck a match and lit the oil lamp, shadows retreating to the corners of the room. The wanted poster he'd torn down in town lay folded in his pocket, a persistent weight against his chest. He didn't need to look at it again. His own face stared back from that paper, alongside words that burned like brands. Wanted for murder and betrayal. $500, enough to tempt any desperate soul in these parts. The kitchen stood as a monument to neglect. Unwashed dishes formed precarious towers beside the wash basin. What remained of yesterday's coffee had congealed in the bottom of the pot, thick as tar and twice as bitter. Jacob sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He wasn't built for this. The keeping of a house, the tending of domestic affairs. The ranch hands had their own quarters and duties. The cattle needed tending, fences needed mending, and the approaching winter promised no reprieve. "You need help, Thorne," Sheriff Dawson had told him that afternoon, voice lowered as they stood outside the general store. "Can't keep going like this. Ranch will fall apart, and then where'll you be?" "I manage," Jacob had replied, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears. "Mason's widow is looking to place her girl somewhere, Rebecca. Quiet thing, but hard working from what I hear. Lost her intended in that mining accident last spring. Could use the position." Now, staring at the shambles of his kitchen, Jacob considered the sheriff's words. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The ranch demanded too much of him already. Perhaps the girl could cook, clean, keep the house in order while he focused on keeping the ranch alive through another winter. The next morning found Jacob riding into the small settlement of Broken Pine. Mrs. Mason's modest cabin sat at the edge of town, smoke curling from the chimney against the crisp blue sky. He tethered his horse and straightened his coat, suddenly conscious of his unshaven face and the dirt ingrained in the lines of his hands. The door opened before he could knock, revealing Eleanor Mason, thin-faced and sharp-eyed as ever. "Thorne," she acknowledged with a curt nod. "Expected you'd come around sooner or later." "Ma'am," he removed his hat, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "Sheriff Dawson mentioned that my Rebecca needs employment." "Yes." She stepped aside, gesturing him in. "She's packing her things." The cabin's interior was spotless, despite its humble furnishings. A quilt of intricate design covered the single bed in the corner, and the scent of fresh bread hung in the air. Jacob stood awkwardly by the door, hat in hand, as Mrs. Mason called for her daughter. Rebecca Mason emerged from behind a curtained alcove, a small carpet bag in her hands. She wasn't what Jacob had expected. Not a girl, but a woman fully grown, perhaps 25, with steady blue eyes that met his without flinching. Her dress was simple but immaculate, her golden hair pulled back in a practical bun. Something in her composed demeanor reminded him painfully of Mary. "Mr. Thorne," she greeted him, voice quiet but clear. "Miss Mason," he nodded, suddenly tongue-tied. Mrs. Mason filled the silence. "Rebecca can cook, clean, mend, and keep accounts. Reads and writes better than most men in this territory. Won't find her shirking or complaint. The position is housekeeping only," Jacob felt compelled to clarify. "I've got hands for the ranch work." "Of course," Rebecca replied, a flicker of something amusement, perhaps crossing her features. "I understand my duties, Mr. Thorne." They discussed terms, room, board, and modest wages paid monthly. Rebecca would have Sundays to herself and could visit town when Jacob made his regular trips for supplies. Simple, straightforward arrangements between employer and employee. Nothing more. "You'll be wanting to head back before dark," Mrs. Mason observed when the matter was settled. She embraced her daughter briefly, whispering something in her ear that Jacob couldn't catch. Rebecca nodded, her expression unreadable. The ride back to the ranch passed in awkward silence. Rebecca sat straight-backed on her own horse, a sturdy mare that Mrs. Mason insisted should go with her. "Girl needs her independence," the older woman had stated, brooking no argument. Jacob found himself stealing glances at his new housekeeper, wondering if he'd made a mistake. She was too young, too pretty to be isolated on a remote ranch with a man nearly twice her age. Tongues would wag in Broken Pine. "I should warn you," he said finally as the ranch buildings came into view. "It's been some time since the house saw a woman's touch. It's not in the best condition. Single quotes. Rebecca's lips curved slightly. "I don't frighten easily, Mr. Thorne." He believed her. There was something resilient in her bearing, a quiet strength beneath the proper exterior. Perhaps this arrangement might work after all. The ranch hands, 3 weather-beaten men who'd been with Jacob for years, watched curiously as he helped Rebecca dismount in the yard. He made terse introductions. Old Pete, who managed the stables, Emmett, who handled most of the fencing and carpentry, and Louise, whose skill with the cattle was unmatched in the territory. They touched their hats respectfully, but Jacob noted the questioning looks they exchanged. Miss Mason will be keeping house, he explained simply. You'll treat her with the same respect you'd show my late wife. The house revealed its neglect in the harsh light of day. Jacob found himself apologizing as he showed Rebecca through the rooms. The kitchen with its unwashed dishes, the parlor thick with dust, the small bedroom off the back that would be hers, Spartan but private. I'll manage, she assured him, already rolling up her sleeve. You must have work to attend to, Mr. Thorne. Don't concern yourself with the house today. By evening, Jacob returned to a transformation. The kitchen gleamed. A stew bubbled on the stove, and the common areas had been swept clean. The scent of soap and something herbal, lavender perhaps, had replaced the stale odor of neglect. Rebecca moved with quiet efficiency, setting the table as if she'd done it 100 times before. You work fast, he observed, washing his hands in the basin she'd prepared. There's satisfaction in setting things right, she replied, ladling stew into a bowl. Sit, Mr. Thorne, you must be hungry. The stew was rich and flavorful, better than anything he'd eaten in months. They ate in companionable silence, the awkwardness of their first meeting giving way to the simple rhythm of shared space. When Rebecca rose to clear the dishes, Jacob found himself studying her profile in the lamplight. There was a grace to her movements, a purpose that spoke of someone who had known hardship but refused to be diminished by it. Thank you, he said simply, when she placed a cup of coffee before him. This was ... needed ... single quotes. She paused, her eyes meeting his. Everyone needs looking after sometimes, Mr. Thorne, even those who prefer solitude. Later, in the quiet of his room, Jacob removed the wanted poster from his coat pocket. His own face stared back at him, rendered in rough lines but unmistakable. The charges were lies fabrications by a powerful man whose greed had cost Jacob everything he'd built in Colorado. But lies backed by wealth and influence had a way of becoming truth in the telling. He should burn it, he knew. Instead, he folded it carefully and tucked it into the false bottom of his trunk, alongside the few remnants of his previous life, a pocket watch that had belonged to his father, a daguerreotype of Mary on their wedding day, and the deed to land he could never reclaim. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new routines. For tonight the house was clean, his belly was full, and for the first time in months, Jacob Thorne slept without the weight of complete solitude pressing down upon his chest. Days on the Thorne ranch fell into a steady rhythm. Rebecca rose before dawn, lit the stove, and had coffee brewing by the time Jacob emerged from his room. They would share a simple breakfast, eggs and biscuits, sometimes bacon when the smokehouse yielded its treasures before Jacob headed out to work the land with his men. Rebecca would spend her days transforming the neglected house into something resembling a home again. The work suited her. After the cramped confines of her mother's cabin and the suffocating pity of Broken Pines residents following Daniel's death and the mine collapse, the spaciousness of the ranch felt like freedom. Here, no one looked at her with sad eyes or whispered about poor Rebecca Mason when they thought she couldn't hear. Here, she was valued for her capable hands and clear head, not defined by her losses. A week into her employment, Rebecca discovered the study. Unlike the rest of the house, this room had remained locked, and Jacob had made no mention of it during her initial tour. She found the key while dusting the mantelpiece in the main room, a small brass key that had fallen behind a weathered copy of Thoreau's Walden. Curiosity, her mother always said, was Rebecca's besetting sin. She turned the key in the lock, telling herself that cleaning was her duty, that no part of the house should remain neglected. The door swung open to reveal a room untouched by the disarray that had plagued the rest of the house. A large oak desk dominated the space, its surface clear except for a leather-bound ledger and an inkwell. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on cattle breeding, land management, and, to her surprise, poetry, Whitman, Wordsworth, and Tennyson. A map of the territory hung on another wall, with the ranch boundaries carefully marked in red ink. But it was the small framed photograph on the desk that captured her attention. A younger Jacob stood beside a dark-haired woman, whose smile transformed her plain features into something luminous. They stood before a different house, grander than the ranch, with pillared porches and tall windows. The Jacob in the photograph wore wealth comfortably, a tailored suit, a gold watch chain, polished boots. Nothing like the weathered rancher who now employed her. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard startled Rebecca from her contemplation. She quickly exited the study, locking the door behind her and returning the key to its hiding place. Through the window she saw Jacob dismounting, his expression grim as he exchanged words with Liaise. Something had happened. Rebecca busied herself at the stove, pretending she hadn't been snooping through her employer's private spaces. The door opened with more force than usual, and Jacob's boots tracked mud across her clean floor as he strode to the wash basin. "Trouble?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral as she sliced bread for the midday meal. Jacob scrubbed at his hands vigorously. "Rustlers, maybe? Found a section of fence cut and 3 head missing. He dried his hands on the towel she offered. "Luis is riding to the neighboring ranches to see if anyone spotted them." Rebecca nodded, setting a plate before him. "Will you report it to Sheriff Dawson?" A shadow crossed Jacob's face. No need to involve the law over 3 cattle. He sat heavily, avoiding her gaze. Best to handle some matters privately. That evening, after Jacob had gone to his room, Rebecca found herself drawn to the window. The moon hung full and bright over the prairie, casting the landscape in silver. In the distance, she could make out the silhouette of a rider approaching. We's returning, perhaps, or one of the other hands. But as the figure drew closer, she realized it was a stranger, a man on a bay horse, moving with purpose toward the ranch house. Rebecca stepped away from the window, her heart suddenly racing. Who would come calling at this hour? She considered waking Jacob, but something held her back. Instead, she took the rifle from its place above the door. Precaution Jacob had insisted upon during her first days, and waited. The rider dismounted in the yard, tethering his horse to the hitching post. In the moonlight, she could see he wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He moved toward the house with the careful steps of a man trying not to announce his presence. Rebecca positioned herself beside the door, rifle raised. When the knock came, 3 soft taps, she steadied her breathing before calling out, "State your business." Pause then. "I'm looking for Jacob Thorne. Tell him Marshal Drake is here." The name meant nothing to her, but the title Marshal sent a chill through her spine. Law enforcement, coming in the night like a thief. Rebecca tightened her grip on the rifle. "Mr. Thorne is asleep. Return in the morning if your business is legitimate." A low chuckle from the other side of the door. "My business won't wait, ma'am, and I think Mr. Thorne would prefer to conduct it privately." The floorboards creaked behind her. Rebecca turned to find Jacob standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the late hour, as if he'd been expecting this visitor. His face was unreadable in the shadows. "It's all right, Rebecca," he said quietly. "I know him." Jacob moved past her to unlock the door. The man who entered removed his hat to reveal a weathered face with shrewd eyes that took in the room, and Rebecca with a single glance. "You didn't mention you had company, Thorne," Marshal Drake remarked, his tone suggesting more than his words. "Miss Mason is my housekeeper," Jacob replied stiffly. "Rebecca, please excuse us. Mr. Drake and I have private matters to discuss." Rebecca hesitated, reluctant to leave Jacob alone with this man who had come like a ghost in the night. But Jacob's expression brooked no argument, so she nodded and retreated to her room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Their voices drifted down the hallway, too low for her to make out more than occasional words: "Colorado" and "testimony" and "Williams won't wait forever." The conversation lasted nearly an hour before she heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of hoofbeats fading into the night. In the morning, Jacob appeared at breakfast with dark circles beneath his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He ate mechanically, responding to Rebecca's attempts at conversation with single-word answers. As he rose to leave, Rebecca finally asked directly, "Is everything all right, Mr. Thorne? Your visitor last night seemed urgent." Jacob paused at the door, his back to her. "Just business from my past, Miss Mason. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." He turned slightly, not quite meeting her eyes. "I would appreciate your discretion regarding Drake's visit. The hands don't need to know about it." Of course, she agreed, though questions burned within her. After Jacob left, Rebecca found herself drawn once more to the study door. The key was where she had returned it, and the temptation to explore further was almost overwhelming. What was Jacob Thorne hiding? Who was he before he came to Montana? Instead, she channeled her curiosity into action, attacking the remaining rooms with renewed vigor. The upstairs bedrooms had been closed off since her arrival, but today she would air them out, wash the linens, and banish the dust that had accumulated since Mary Thorne's passing. The master bedroom was sparse but well appointed. A large bed with a carved headboard, a wardrobe of solid oak, a dressing table that must have belonged to Mary. Rebecca opened the windows to let in the fresh autumn air, then began stripping the bed. When she lifted the mattress to turn it, a folded paper fluttered to the floor. Another wanted poster, identical to the one Jacob had brought home that first day. His face stared up from the yellowed paper, younger but unmistakable, alongside the damning words, "Wanted for murder and betrayal." Rebecca's hands trembled as she unfolded the poster fully, reading the smaller text beneath the charges. "Jacob Thorne, formerly of Silverdale, Colorado, wanted for the murder of Edward Williams, Jr., and betrayal of public trust. Armed and dangerous. $500 reward." The sound of approaching footsteps startled her. Rebecca quickly refolded the poster and slipped it into her apron pocket just as Jacob appeared in the doorway. "I forgot my..." he began, then stopped, his eyes narrowing at whatever he saw in her face. "Is something wrong, Miss Mason?" "Nothing at all," she managed, forcing a smile. "Just a bit winded from the stairs." Jacob studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Don't overexert yourself. The upstairs can wait if needed." "I'm nearly finished here," she assured him. After he left, taking a forgotten ledger with him, Rebecca removed the poster from her pocket and stared at it once more. The man who employed her, the man whose food she cooked and whose house she cleaned, was wanted for murder. And somehow she doubted this was the only secret Jacob Thorne was keeping. Knowledge was a dangerous thing. Rebecca had always believed this, but never had the truth of it weighed so heavily upon her as it did now. with Jacob Thorne's wanted poster hidden beneath the floorboard under her bed. Each night she removed it, studying the words as if they might rearrange themselves into a less damning configuration. Each morning she replaced it, the secret a stone in her chest as she served breakfast to a man wanted for murder. A week passed since her discovery. Rebecca watched Jacob with new eyes, searching for signs of the killer described on that yellowed paper. She saw instead a man who spoke gently to his horses, who never raised his voice to his ranch hands, left his boots outside on rainy days so as not to track mud across her clean floors. Could such a man have blood on his hands? She recalled the photograph from his study, Jacob in finer clothes, with a woman who must have been the mysterious Mary. Not a rancher then, but a man of means. What had happened in Colorado? What had driven him to this remote corner of Montana, living under a name that might not even be his own? Rebecca knew she should report him. Sheriff Dawson rode out to the ranch occasionally, ostensibly to share news, but clearly checking on her welfare. It would be simple enough to slip him the poster, to whisper what she had found. Yet something held her back, not fear, but doubt. The charges seemed at odds with the man she had come to know. On Sunday, her day off, Rebecca rode into Broken Pine to attend church services and visit her mother. The small white clapboard building was already filling with townspeople when she arrived, their curious glances following her as she took a seat beside Eleanor Mason. "You're looking well," her mother observed, patting her hand. "Ranch life agrees with you. The work keeps me busy," Rebecca replied, careful to keep her voice neutral. She had no intention of sharing her discovery with her mother, whose sense of propriety would demand immediate action. After the service, several women approached, eager for news from the Thorne ranch. Their interest was thinly veiled as concern. "Living all alone with that man," Mrs. Peterson clucked, adjusting her hat. "It hardly seems proper, dear." "Mr. Thorne is a perfect gentleman," Rebecca replied firmly, "and I am hardly alone with 3 ranch hands on the property." "Still," Merce Abernathy chimed in, "one wonders about a man who arrived so suddenly with so little known about his past. No family connections, no letters of reference." Rebecca felt a flicker of unease. "Thorne's history is his own affair," she said, though the words rang hollow given her own investigation. Her mother frowned at the exchange, but waited until they were alone in her cabin before speaking. "Is there something you're not telling me, Rebecca, about Jacob Thorne?" "Nothing worth mentioning," Rebecca lied, busying herself with the tea kettle. "He's a private man, that's all." Eleanor studied her daughter with shrewd eyes. "Private men often have reasons for their privacy, reasons a young woman in a vulnerable position should be aware of." "I'm hardly vulnerable, Mother. I can handle myself." "Like you handled Daniel's death?" Eleanor's voice softened. "Throwing yourself into work won't heal that wound, child." Rebecca stiffened. "This has nothing to do with Daniel, doesn't it? You've been running from his memory since the accident, taking this position in the middle of nowhere, isolating yourself." "I took this position because we needed the money," Rebecca interrupted, "and because I couldn't bear another day of pity and glances in town." Her mother sighed, relenting. "I only want your happiness, Rebecca, and your safety." Later, as Rebecca prepared to leave, Sheriff Dawson approached her outside the general store where she'd stopped for supplies. "Miss Mason," he greeted her, touching the brim of his hat. "Glad to see you in town. Everything all right out at Thorne's place?" "Perfectly fine, thank you," she replied, securing her purchases to her saddle. The sheriff leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Had a peculiar visitor last week. U.S. Marshal asking questions about new arrivals to the territory. Seemed particularly interested in men matching Thorne's description." Rebecca's heart stuttered. "Did he say why?" "Some business in Colorado," Dawson shrugged. "Wouldn't give details. Just thought you should know, being out there alone with him. I appreciate your concern," Rebecca managed, "but I've no reason to fear Mr. Thorne." As she rode back to the ranch, Rebecca's thoughts churned. A.U.S. Marshal making inquiries confirmed that Jacob was indeed being hunted. Yet the marshal who had visited the ranch Drake had spoken with Jacob privately, made no attempt to arrest him. What game was being played here? The sun was setting when she arrived, painting the horizon in fiery streaks of orange and crimson. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the windows. Despite everything, the sight brought a comfort she was reluctant to acknowledge. Jacob emerged from the barn as she dismounted, taking the reins of her mare. "Thought you might stay in town tonight," he remarked, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Mother's cabin is too cramped for my taste now," she replied, gathering her purchases. "I've grown accustomed to space." He nodded, leading her horse toward the stable. "Dinner's keeping warm on the stove. Nothing fancy, just stew." The domesticity of the moment struck Rebecca with unexpected force. This man, this possible murderer, had prepared a meal in her absence, had watched for her return. The contradiction of it twisted inside her like a knife. Inside, the house was warm and filled with the rich aroma of beef stew. Jacob had set the table, laid out bread and butter, even opened a jar of her pickled beets. Rebecca removed her coat and hat, settling into the familiar rhythm of their shared evenings despite the tension coiled within her. They ate in companionable silence until Jacob asked, "How was town?" Rebecca considered her words carefully. "Full of the usual gossip. Mrs. Peterson continues to find our arrangement scandalous." A brief smile touched Jacob's lips. "Small towns thrive on scandal, real or imagined." Sheriff Dawson mentioned a U.S. Marshal asking questions, she said, watching his reaction closely. "About newcomers to the territory." Jacob's hand paused, spoon halfway to his mouth before resuming its motion with deliberate casualness. "Did he now?" "He seemed to think the marshal's interest might concern you." "Dawson always did have an overactive imagination," Jacob replied, but his knuckles had whitened around his spoon. "Did he say anything else?" only that the marshal's business related to Colorado. The silence that followed stretched taut between them. Finally, Jacob set down his spoon and met her gaze directly. "If you have questions, Rebecca, you should ask them plainly." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Is your name truly Jacob Thorne?" "It is now," he answered, his voice low and steady. "It's the name on the deed to this ranch, the name I've built a life around these past 2 years. And before that," he studied her for a long moment, "before that I was someone else, someone who made enemies powerful enough to distort the truth." "The truth about what?" Rebecca pressed, her courage mounting. "About murder? About betrayal?" Jacob's expression darkened. "Where did you hear those words?" The moment of decision had arrived. Rebecca stood, moving to the small desk in the corner where she kept household accounts. From beneath a stack of papers, she withdrew the wanted poster and placed it on the table between them. "I found this while cleaning," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Your face, your crimes." Jacob stared at the poster, something like grief passing across his features. "And yet you're still here," he observed quietly. "Why didn't you show this to Dawson today?" It was the question Rebecca had been asking herself since finding the poster. The answer came to her now, simple and profound. "Because I don't believe it," she admitted. "Or at least I don't believe it's the whole truth." Jacob's shoulders sagged slightly, whether in relief or resignation she couldn't tell. "It's not," he confirmed. "But the full truth is far more complicated and far more dangerous than what's written there. Tell me," Rebecca said, sitting down again. "I deserve to know what kind of man I'm working for, what kind of man I'm defending with my silence." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows as darkness settled fully over the ranch. Inside, Jacob Thorne prepared to reveal the secret that had driven him across state lines and into hiding, unaware that forces were already closing in, drawn by the smell of revenge and reward money. Jacob rose from the table, retrieving a bottle of whiskey from a cabinet Rebecca had never seen him open. He poured 2 small measures, sliding one across to her before settling back into his chair. The amber liquid caught the lamplight as he turned the glass in his fingers, gathering his thoughts. "In Colorado, I was James Thomas," he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I owned a silver mine near Silverdale, the Blue Creek operation. It was profitable, employed nearly 50 men. I had a house in town, respect in the community. Mary and I had built a good life." Rebecca sipped the whiskey, its warmth spreading through her chest as she listened. "Edward Williams, S.R., was the most powerful man in the county, owned the bank. Half the businesses had the mayor and sheriff in his pocket. His son, Edward Jr., was cut from the same cloth, entitled Ruthless. When silver was discovered on my property, the Williams family wanted it." Jacob's eyes grew distant, seeing not the ranch kitchen but memories of another life. "At first they tried to buy me out. When I refused, they started causing problems. Miners intimidated, equipment sabotaged. Then they tried to frame me for claim jumping on Williams' land." He took a swallow of whiskey. "I had proof of their corruption documents showing how they'd swindled other mine owners, falsified deeds, bribed officials. I was building a case to take to the federal authorities. Edward Jr. found out." "What happened?" Rebecca asked softly when he fell silent. "He came to my office one night, drunk and angry. Threatened Mary, said he'd make sure she suffered if I didn't surrender the documents. We fought." Jacob's hand tightened around his glass. He drew a gun. In the struggle, it went off. The bullet caught him in the chest. Rebecca's breath caught. "Self-defense. That's how I saw it. But with his father controlling the law in Silverdale, it didn't matter. By morning, the story was that I'd murdered Edward Jr. in cold blood to prevent him from exposing my illegal activities. Every witness was paid to lie, every piece of evidence twisted. And Mary?" Pain flashed across Jacob's features. "She believed me, stood by me. I was arrested awaiting trial when Marshal Drake arrived in town. He'd been investigating the Williams family for years. Land fraud, corruption, even murder. He'd heard rumors about my evidence." Jacob leaned forward, lowering his voice further. "Drake helped me escape custody. In return, I gave him the documents I'd gathered, proof that could bring down not just the Williams family, but half the corrupt officials in Colorado. He promised to clear my name once the case was built." "Is that what he came to discuss the other night?" Rebecca asked. Jacob nodded. "The case is moving forward. Williams Azar has been indicted by a federal grand jury, but he's using his remaining influence to hunt me down before I can testify. The wanted poster is his doing, a way to turn every bounty hunter and lawman in the territory against me. And Marshal Drake? Why hasn't he cleared your name?" The wheels of justice turned slowly. Jacob replied with a bitter smile. "Drake needs me alive to testify when the case goes to trial. Until then, I remain a fugitive, officially wanted but unofficially protected as long as I stay hidden." Rebecca studied him across the table, weighing his words against the man she had come to know. The story was extraordinary, yet it aligned with the careful, principled rancher who had given her employment and respect. "I believe you," she said finally. Relief washed over Jacob's face, softening the hard lines of worry. "I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, or if you choose to leave now that you know the danger." "Danger? Williams has men searching for me. Professional hunters who won't hesitate to kill anyone in their way. If they discover I'm here, ... single quotes." He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. Rebecca straightened her shoulders. "I'm not easily frightened, Emmer Thorne, or should I call you Mr. Thomas now?" "Thorne is safer for both of us," he replied. "The fewer people who know my true identity, the better. Then Thorne it remains." She stood, gathering their empty glasses. "Is there anything else I should know? Any other secrets hiding in this house?" Jacob hesitated. then shook his head. Nothing that puts you at risk. Later, alone in her room, Rebecca replayed their conversation. Jacob's story explains so much. The study with its evidence of a different life, his reluctance to interact with the law, the midnight visit from Marshal Drake, yet she sensed he was still withholding something. Some piece of the puzzle he deemed too dangerous to share. Sleep eluded her. Near midnight, she lit a small lamp and opened her Bible, seeking comfort in familiar verses. A folded letter slipped from between the pages, Daniel's last note to her before the mining accident claimed his life. She had carried it as a talisman of grief, a reminder of dreams shattered in an instant. Now, as she read his loving words, Rebecca realized the letter had become lighter in her hands, the pain of loss no longer quite so sharp. When had that happened? When had the wound begun to heal without her noticing? A sound from outside drew her to the window. In the moonlit yard, Jacob stood beside the corral, rifle in hand, scanning the darkness beyond the fence line. Standing guard, she realized, protecting his home, protecting her. The next morning brought clear skies and a biting chill that hinted at the approaching winter. Rebecca found Jacob at the kitchen table, examining a map spread before him. Dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he'd gotten little sleep. "You should have woken me for my shift," she said, stoking the stove. He looked up, surprised. "Your shift? If we're to stand guard against Williams' men, we should share the duty," she replied matter-of-factly, setting coffee to boil. "I'm quite capable with a rifle. This isn't your fight, Rebecca. You made it my fight when you hired me," she countered. "This is my home now, too." Something flickered in Jacob's eyes, gratitude perhaps, or something warmer. "I won't risk your safety. My safety was compromised the moment I found that poster and chose not to turn you in," she said, placing a cup of coffee before him. "We're in this together now, whether you like it or not." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching riders shattered the morning quiet. Jacob was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with practiced caution. Rebecca joined him, peering past his shoulder at the three men riding toward the ranch house. "Trouble?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flutter of fear in her chest. "Not Williams' men," Jacob replied, tension easing from his shoulders. "It's Lise returning with supplies from town." His relief was short-lived as he noted, "He's riding hard. Something's wrong." They stepped onto the porch as Lise galloped into the yard, followed by Emmett and old Pete. The ranch hand reined in sharp, dust billowing around his horse's hooves. "Riders asking about you in town, patron," Luis reported, dismounting. "Four men heavily armed, offering money for information about newcomers matching your description." Jacob's expression darkened. "Did they speak to Dawson?" For near an hour, Emmett confirmed, wiping sweat from his brow. Sheriff looked mighty interested in what they had to say. Old Pete spat a stream of tobacco juice. "They're showing a newer version of that wanted poster. Rewards up to $1,000 now." Rebecca felt Jacob tense beside her. "When did they leave town?" "This morning," Lise answered. "They were headed west, but Pete here thinks they were just putting on a show. They'll circle back after dark," the old man had. "Come at the ranch from the north, likely." Jacob nodded grimly. "Get everything valuable from the bunkhouse. We're fortifying the main house." As the men hurried to comply, Rebecca touched Jacob's arm. "What are you thinking?" His eyes met hers, resolute and fierce. "I'm thinking it's time to stop running and make a stand." Inside, Jacob retrieved a wooden chest from beneath the floorboards in his bed. Cache of weapons Rebecca hadn't known existed. Rifles, pistols, boxes of ammunition. The tools of a man who had lived too long expecting violence to find him. "Can your men be trusted?" she asked as he checked each weapon with practiced efficiency. "If these bounty hunters offer them part of the reward, Luis, Emmett, and Pete have been with me since I bought this ranch." Jacob interrupted. "They don't know my full story, but they're loyal. They'll fight." Rebecca picked up one of the revolvers, testing its weight in her hand. "So will I." Jacob paused, studying her with newfound appreciation. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Mason." "Good," she replied with a small smile. "Predictable women are terribly dull, don't you think?" As dusk approached, the ranch fell into tense silence. Lise and Emmett took positions upstairs, covering the approaches to the house. Old Pete manned the kitchen window with a shotgun, while Jacob and Rebecca prepared to defend the front entrance. "If things go badly," Jacob said quietly as they checked their weapons one final time, "there's a tunnel beneath the root cellar. It comes out a quarter-mile east near the creek. Mary insisted on having it built when we first arrived. She never trusted that we were truly safe here." "Smart woman," Rebecca observed. Jacob's smile was tinged with sadness. "She would have liked you." Before Rebecca could respond, old Pete's low whistle signaled movement from the north. Jacob extinguished the lamps, plunging the house into darkness. In the sudden silence, Rebecca could hear her own heartbeat, steady and strong despite the danger. Jacob moved to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the curtains. His breath caught. "How many?" Rebecca whispered, joining him. "6," he replied grimly. "More than Luis reported, and they're spreading out to surround the house in the moonlight filtering through the window." Jacob's face was all angles and shadows, the face of a man preparing for battle. Rebecca realized with sudden clarity that she was no longer afraid, not of the men approaching through the darkness, not of the violence to come, and not of the man standing beside her, wanted for murder but innocent in her eyes. Whatever happened next, she had made her choice. She was standing with Jacob Thorne. The bounty hunters moved like shadows across the moonlit yard, weapons glinting dully as they took positions around the house. Their leader, a tall man with a distinctive limp, gestured silently, directing two men toward the barn while the others approached the main house from different angles. "They're professionals," Jacob whispered, easing away from the window. Splitting up to cut off all escape routes, Rebecca tightened her grip on the revolver. They don't know we're ready for them. From upstairs came the muffled sound of Louis' shifting position. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, a sound that would be imperceptible under normal circumstances but seemed thunderous in the tense silence. The bounty hunters froze, heads tilting upward. Their leader motioned sharply, abandoning stealth for speed. The man nearest the porch rushed forward, boot connecting with the front door in a splintering kick. Jacob fired first, the rifle's report shattering the night. The bounty hunter stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. Instantly, the yard erupted in gunfire. Bullets punched through windows and thudded into the log walls as Rebecca and Jacob dropped to the floor. "They're trying to pin us down," Jacob shouted over the din. "Lise, the north side!" Upstairs, Lie responded with steady rifle fire, forcing the men approaching from that direction to seek cover. Old Pete's shotgun blasted from the kitchen, its distinctive boom momentarily drowning out the sharper cracks of the rifles. Rebecca crawled to the other window, rising just enough to peer outside. A figure darted from the woodpile to the water trough, closing distance to the house. She sighted down the revolver's barrel, her hand surprisingly steady, and squeezed the trigger. The man yelped, diving for cover. "Good shot," Jacob approved, reloading his rifle with practiced speed. "We need to keep them back until dawn. They won't want to be caught in the open in daylight." A new volley of gunfire peppered the house, glass shattering as a bullet found the front window. Rebecca flinched as shards rained down around her but held her position. Through the broken window, she heard the leader's voice for the first time, a harsh command cutting through the chaos. "Thorne, we know you're in there. Come out now, and the others can live." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Keep firing," he told Rebecca. "I need to check on Pete." He crawled toward the kitchen, staying low. Rebecca turned her attention back to the yard, where the bounty hunters were regrouping behind the cover of the well and woodpile. She fired twice more, forcing them to keep their heads down. A sudden cry from the kitchen jolted her. "Jacob!" She hesitated, torn between her position and the need to help. When a second cry came, this one clearly from old Pete, and filled with pain, she abandoned the window. Crawling rapidly toward the kitchen, the scene that greeted her sent ice through her veins. Old Pete lay on the floor, blood spreading across his shirt from a wound in his chest. Jacob knelt beside him, pressing a cloth to the injury with one hand while his rifle lay forgotten nearby. "Bullet came through the window," Jacob explained tersely. "Caught him just below the collarbone." Old Pete's weathered face was pale, his breathing labored. "Damn poor luck," he managed, his voice a raspy whisper. A floorboard creaked behind them. Rebecca whirled, raising her revolver just as a figure appeared in the kitchen doorway. She recognized Lias, his face streaked with sweat and gunpowder. "Emmett's hit," he reported grimly. "Arms broken. He can still shoot, but he's losing blood." Jacob muttered a curse. "We're being picked off one by one. Get Pete upstairs where it's safer." Rebecca helped Luis. As they maneuvered the injured man toward the stairs, a new sound reached them, the crackle of flames. Jacob rushed to the front room, Rebecca close behind. Through the broken window, they could see the bounty hunters had lit torches. "They're going to burn us out," Rebecca realized, horror dawning. Jacob's expression hardened. "No. They want me alive for the reward. This is just to force us into the open." The first torch arced through the air, landing on the porch. Flames licked at the weathered wood, spreading quickly toward the front door. A second torch followed, crashing through the broken window to land on the rug. Jacob stomped it out quickly, but smoke was already beginning to fill the room. "We can't stay," Rebecca coughed, eyes watering from the acrid smoke. "Pete and Emmett need medical attention." Jacob nodded grimly. "The tunnel. It's our only chance now." He moved to the window, firing several shots to force the bounty hunters back. "Lise, get everyone to the cellar. We're leaving." Lise appeared at the top of the stairs, supporting Emmett, whose face was gray with pain, his right arm bound in a makeshift sling. "What about old Pete? He can barely walk." "I'll carry him," Jacob decided. "Rebecca, cover us." She positioned herself by the front window, firing methodically at any movement she detected. The smoke was thickening, making it difficult to see or breathe. The flames had engulfed the porch now, hungry tongues of fire reaching for the main structure of the house. Jacob returned from the stairs, rifle slung across his back. "They're in the cellar. Let's go." They retreated toward the kitchen, staying low beneath the worst of the smoke. A crash from the front of the house told them the porch roof had collapsed. Fire would spread quickly through the wooden structure. In the kitchen, Jacob paused, fresh and conflicted. "There's something I need to get." "There's no time," Rebecca protested. "It will only take a moment. Get to the cellar and help Luis with the tunnel entrance. It's behind the north wall, behind the shelving." Before she could argue, he disappeared down the hallway toward his bed. Rebecca hesitated, torn between following his instructions and ensuring he didn't risk his life for some possession. The decision was made for her when a section of the ceiling collapsed in the front room, blocking the hallway with burning debris. "Jacob," she screamed, lunging forward only to be driven back by intense heat. No answer came. Choking on smoke, Rebecca had no choice but to retreat to the cellar stairs. Descending into relative coolness with tears streaming down her face from the smoke or fear, she couldn't tell. Luis had already moved the shelving unit, revealing a narrow tunnel dug into the earth and shored up with timber. Old Pete lay nearby, his breathing shallow, while Emmett leaned against the wall, clutching his injured arm. "Where's the patron?" Luis demanded. "Trapped," Rebecca managed between coughs. The ceiling collapsed. Luis's expression darkened. "I'll go back for him." "No." she said firmly, collecting herself. You need to get Pete and Emmett to safety. I'll find Jacob. Before he could protest, she was moving back up the stairs, a wet cloth pressed to her mouth and nose. The kitchen was nearly engulfed now, flames crawling across the ceiling and devouring the curtains. The heat was overwhelming, pressing against her like a physical force. Jacob, she called, searching desperately for a way past the blockage in the hallway. A crash from her right startled her. Jacob staggered through what remained of the back door, his clothing sin, face blackened with soot. In his arms he clutched a small wooden box. What were you thinking? Rebecca cried, rushing to support him as he stumbled. Couldn't leave it, he gasped, allowing her to guide him toward the cellar stairs. Mary's letters. And this. He thrust the box into her hands as they descended the stairs. Rebecca glimpsed what he had risked his life to save. His stack of yellowed envelopes tied with faded ribbon, a small daguerreotype, and beneath them, a leather portfolio bulging with papers. The evidence against Williams, she realized. You kept a copy. Jacob nodded, leaning heavily against the wall. Insurance and leverage, if needed. Lewis had already helped Emmett into the tunnel, and now returned for old Pete. The house won't stand much longer, he warned, lifting the injured man as gently as possible. We need to move. The tunnel was narrow and damp, its earthen walls supported by rough-hewn beams. They moved in single file, Jacob taking the lead with a small lantern while Rebecca brought up the rear, the precious box clutched against her chest. Above them, they could hear the muffled roar of the fire consuming the ranch house. Will they follow us? Rebecca asked quietly. They'll search the ruins first, Jacob replied. By then we should reach the creek. The tunnel seemed endless, the air growing thinner as they progressed. Old Pete's labored breathing echoed in the confined space, punctuated by Emmett's occasional groan when his injured arm brushed against the wall. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, Jacob stopped. We're here. He reached up, pushing against a wooden trapdoor concealed beneath brush and soil. Cool night air rushed in as the door swung open, sweet and clean after the smoky confines of the tunnel. One by one, they emerged onto the banks of the creek, the burning ranch house visible as a distant glow through the trees. Rebecca helped Louis settle the injured men in the shelter of a large cottonwood, then joined Jacob, who stood watching the distant fire, his expression unreadable. Everything we had, he said softly. Gone. She placed a hand on his arm. Not everything. He looked down at her, something shifting in his gaze. Without warning, he pulled her against him, his embrace fierce and desperate. Rebecca returned it without hesitation, her arms circling his waist, her cheek pressed against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. I thought I'd lost you, she whispered. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head. It would take more than fire to keep me from returning to you. The admission hung between them, fragile and momentous. Then Luce's voice broke the spell. Riders coming from the east, he warned. 6, maybe more. Single quotes. Jacob released Rebecca reluctantly, turning to face this new threat. Williams' men must have sent for reinforcements. What do we do now? Rebecca asked, the brief moment of connection giving way to renewed fear. Jacob's jaw set in a determined line. We split up. Luis and I will lead them away from you and the injured men. No, Rebecca protested. We stay together. There's no time to argue, Jacob insisted. Get Pete and Emmett to town. Find Doc Sullivan, he can be trusted. I'll circle back and meet you there when it's safe. Lewis was already preparing to leave, checking his ammunition with grim efficiency. Jacob turned to Rebecca once more, his eyes softening. Keep this safe, he said, pressing the wooden box into her hands. If anything happens to me, get it to Marshal Drake. He'll know what to do. Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her. Brief but fervent, a promise and a farewell combined. Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness with Lise at his side, leaving Rebecca standing by the creek with 2 injured men and the uncertain light of dawn breaking on the horizon. Dawn broke over the Montana landscape, painting the rolling hills in soft gold as Rebecca guided the stolen horse along the creek bed. Old Pete lay slumped across the saddle, his breathing shallow but persistent. Emmett followed on foot, his face gray with pain, but his steps determined. They had found the horse, one of the bounty hunter's mounts, grazing near the tunnel exit. A stroke of luck in a night filled with misfortune. How much further? Emmett asked, cradling his broken arm against his chest. Rebecca squinted at the horizon. Another hour. Maybe less. She adjusted her grip on the reins, the wooden box containing Jacob's precious documents secured firmly in her saddlebag. Can you make it? Emmett nodded grimly. Been through worse. Was worried about old Pete. As if hearing his name, the elderly ranch hand stirred, mumbling incoherently, and the makeshift bandage on his chest was soaked through with blood, the stain spreading slowly across his worn shirt. Rebecca's heart clenched with fear. Pete needed a doctor, and soon. We'll rest a moment, she decided, guiding the horse to a small copse of trees that offered some shelter from prying eyes. She helped Emmett sit with his back against a trunk, then carefully lowered Pete from the saddle, positioning him on a bed of her coat. While Emmett kept watch, Rebecca checked Pete's wound, her stomach turning at the sight of torn flesh and seeping blood. The bullet had entered just below his collarbone, missing his heart but causing significant damage. She cleaned it as best she could with water from her canteen, then rebandaged it with strips torn from her petticoat. Will he make it? Emmett asked quietly. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. He's strong and stubborn. They both knew it wasn't an answer, but it was the only comfort she could offer. After allowing the horse to drink from the creek and rest briefly, they continued their journey. The sun climbing higher in the sky as broken pine came into view, a scatter of buildings nestled against the foothills, thin threads of smoke rising from morning fires. Rebecca hesitated at the edge of town, suddenly aware of how they must appeared, disheveled, blood-stained. Arriving with one man unconscious and another injured. Questions would be asked, suspicions aroused. "We need a story," she told him. "Something to explain your injuries without mentioning the bounty hunters." Emmett considered for a moment. "Barn fire," he suggested. "Beam collapsed on Pete. I broke my arm trying to pull him out, and Jacob and Leah stayed behind to salvage what they could." He shrugged. Simple. Believable. Rebecca nodded, satisfied. "Head straight for Doc Sullivan's. I'll find my mother and meet you there." They separated at the edge of town, Emmett leading the horse bearing old Pete toward the doctor's house, while Rebecca made her way to Eleanor Mason's cabin, the wooden box clutched beneath her shawl. She drew curious glances from early risers, her smoke-stained dress and disheveled appearance marking her as someone touched by calamity. Eleanor was hanging washing when Rebecca approached, her mother's hands freezing mid-motion as she caught sight of her daughter. "Rebecca, what in heaven's name?" "There's been a fire," Rebecca interrupted. "The practice lie coming easily. The ranch house is gone. 2 men are injured. I need fresh clothes and whatever medical supplies you have." To her credit, Eleanor asked no further questions, ushering Rebecca inside and quickly gathering the requested item. Only when Rebecca had washed her face and changed into a clean dress did her mother speak again. "Sheriff Dawson was here yesterday asking about Jacob Thorne," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Seemed particularly interested in whether you'd mentioned any unusual visitors." Rebecca stilled, her fingers pausing as she buttoned her bodice. "What did you tell him?" "That my daughter doesn't gossip about her employer." Eleanor's shrewd eyes studied Rebecca's face. "But I'm beginning to wonder if I should have been more forthcoming." "Mother, those aren't burns on your dress," Eleanor interrupted, picking up the discarded garment. "Those are bullet holes, and that's blood, not soot." She set the dress down, her expression hardening. "Tell me what's really happening, Rebecca." Now, Rebecca hesitated, torn between the need for secrecy and the desire to unburden herself. Finally, she sank into a chair, the weight of the night's events pressing down upon her. "Cook, cook, 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 She told her mother everything: the wanted poster, Jacob's true identity, the corruption in Colorado, the bounty hunters who had come to claim the reward. Eleanor listened in silence, her expression shifting from shock to concern to something like admiration. "And you chose to stand with him," she said when Rebecca had finished, "against armed men, against the law itself." "He's innocent," Rebecca insisted. "The law in this case is wrong." Eleanor sighed, moving to place a gentle hand on her daughter's cheek. "You're in love with him." It wasn't a question, and Rebecca didn't treat it as one. The realization had been growing within her for days, perhaps longer, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire that had consumed the ranch house. "I have to get to Doc Sullivan's," she said instead of answering. "Pete might not survive without proper care." Eleanor nodded, practical as always. "Go. I'll bring food later." She hesitated, then added, "Be careful, Rebecca. Men like this Marshall Drake and the Williams family, they don't play by normal rules. And neither does Sheriff Dawson when there's money involved." Rebecca secured the wooden box in her mother's hidden root cellar before hurrying to the doctor's house, a modest building with a small sign designating it as both residence and medical practice. Inside, she found Doc Sullivan, a gruff man in his 60s with steady hands and a reputation for discretion, already at work on old Pete, his sleeves rolled up and bloody. "Barn fire, my foot," he muttered when Rebecca entered. "I've treated enough gunshot wounds to know one when I see it." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Emmett, who sat on a chair nearby, his arm now properly splinted and bandaged. "Will he live?" she asked, nodding toward Pete. "If infection doesn't set in," Sullivan replied, continuing his work. "Bullet missed anything vital, but he lost a lot of blood. He's tough, though. Might pull through." Relief washed over Rebecca. "Thank you, Doctor." Dr. Sullivan grunted, finishing the last stitch and cutting the thread. "Don't thank me yet. Sheriff's on his way. One of his deputies saw you coming into town." He fixed Rebecca with a pointed look. "Whatever story you're telling, you'd better make it convincing." As if summoned by the words, the door opened to reveal Sheriff Dawson, his badge gleaming on his chest, his eyes narrowing as they took in the scene before him. "Miss Mason," he greeted her, removing his hat. "Heard there was trouble out at Thorne's place." "A fire," Rebecca confirmed, the lie bitter on her tongue. "The ranch house is destroyed." Dawson nodded slowly, his gaze shifting between her, Emmett, and the unconscious form of old Pete. "Strange coincidence." That fire, especially coming right after those men were asking about Thorne in town. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral. What men would those be, Sheriff? Professional bounty hunters, Dawson replied, watching her closely for any reaction. Looking for a fugitive from Colorado. Murder suspect. He paused meaningfully. Fellow matching Thorne's description exactly. How terrible, Rebecca managed. I hope they find him. Oh. I expect they will. Dawson moved closer, his voice dropping. Where is Thorne now, Miss Mason? And don't tell me he's sifting through the ashes because my deputy rode out there this morning. Place is deserted. Emmett shifted in his chair, his good hand inching toward the knife at his belt. Rebecca shot him a warning glance before facing Dawson again. Mr. Thorne and Louise rode to the Carson property to seek assistance after the fire, she lied smoothly. We expected them to return by now. Perhaps they were delayed. Dawson studied her for a long moment, disbelief evident in his eyes. Miss Mason, I've known you since you were a girl. Never took you for a liar. He sighed, replacing his hat. I'll be keeping an eye on this place. When Thorne shows his face in, he will. He cares for you as much as I suspect he does. Wait. After the sheriff left, Rebecca slumped against the wall, the tension draining from her body. Doc Sullivan busied himself with checking Emmett's splint, pretending not to have heard the exchange. He knows, Emmett said quietly. About the patron. Yes. Rebecca, and he's working with the bounty hunters. Sullivan cleared his throat. Not to interrupt this fascinating conversation, but if your employer is indeed a wanted man, you might want to consider getting these two somewhere less obvious. He nodded toward Pete. He's stable enough to move. If you're careful, single quotes Rebecca straightened, decision crystallizing. My mother's cabin. We'll take them there at nightfall. The doctor nodded approval. I'll come check on them tomorrow. And Miss Mason? He fixed her with a stern gaze. Whatever trouble you're in, be sure it's worth the cost. As dusk settled over Broken Pine, Rebecca stood at her mother's window, watching for any sign of Jacob or Louis. The injured men were settled as comfortably as possible in Eleanor's small home. Pete still unconscious but breathing steadily, Emmett dozing fitfully in a chair. The wooden box sat open on the table, its contents spread before her Mary's letters, the daguerreotype showing a younger, happier Jacob, and the leather portfolio containing the evidence against William. Rebecca had read through the documents carefully, her stomach turning at the detailed accounts of corruption, extortion, and even murder perpetrated by a man wealthy enough to bend the law to his will. He was telling the truth, Eleanor observed, joining her daughter at the window. About everything. Rebecca nodded, her eyes still scanning the darkening street. And now he's out there somewhere? Hunted like an animal for crimes he didn't commit? Eleanor's hand came to rest on her shoulder. He'll come for you, she said with quiet certainty. Men like that always do. Outside, the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky, silent witnesses to promises made and kept, to sacrifices offered and accepted. Somewhere beyond the town limits, Jacob Thorne rode through the gathering darkness, his path leading inevitably back to the woman who had chosen to stand beside him against the world. Jacob and Louise rode hard through the night, cutting across country to avoid the main trails. The bounty hunters had pursued them for miles before. Jacob led them into a narrow canyon where the rocky terrain forced them to dismount. Louise had set a small avalanche of boulders to block the passage behind them, buying precious time as they escaped through a series of interconnected ravines known only to local ranchers. Now, as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern sky, they crouched on a ridge overlooking the road to Broken Pine, their horses hidden in a stand of pines behind them. Jacob's body ached from the night's exertions, the burns on his hands throbbing beneath makeshift bandages. But it was worry for Rebecca, not physical pain, that lined his face as he studied the distant town through his spyglass. Any sign of them? Lise asked, his voice rough from smoke and exhaustion. Jacob shook his head. Nothing. But they made it. They had to. He refused to consider the alternative. Rebecca was resourceful, determined. She would have gotten Pete and Emmett to safety. Louis nodded, trusting his employer's judgment. What now, patron? Before Jacob could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats froze them both. They melted back into the cover of the trees, weapons ready, as a lone rider appeared on the road below. Jacob raised the spyglass again, tension easing from his shoulders as he recognized the figure. It's Drake, he said, rising to his feet. Stay alert, but I think we're safe. They guided their horses down to intercept the marshal, who reined in sharply at their approach, hand instinctively moving to his sidearm before recognition dawned. Thorne Drake greeted him with a curt nod. Or should I say Thomas? You're a hard man to find. His gaze shifted to Louis, then back to Jacob. Your ranch house is a smoking ruin. Want to tell me what happened? Jacob explained briefly. The bounty hunters, the firefight, the escape through the tunnel. Drake listened without interruption, his weathered face growing grimmer with each detail. Williams is getting desperate, the marshal observed when Jacob finished. That's good and bad news for us. How so? Good because the federal prosecutor is ready to move. The grand jury has returned indictments against Williams SR and half the officials in Silverdale. Drake reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded document. This is a federal writ, clearing your name, contingent on your testimony. Jacob took the paper, emotions warring within him as he read the official language that could restore his freedom. After 2 years of living as a fugitive, the end was finally in sight. And the bad news? he asked, refolding the writ carefully. Drake's expression darkened. Williams knows we're close to bringing him down. He's hired every gun he can find to silence you before the trial. The men who attacked your ranch are just the first wave. How many more? At least a dozen spread across the territory, all looking for a man matching your description, all carrying that wanted poster with your face on it. Drake sighed, and Williams has friends in high places. The governor's office is dragging its feet on acknowledging the federal investigation. Louis shifted uneasily. The sheriff in Broken Pine, he seemed too interested in those bounty hunters. Dawson? Drake nodded. He telegraphed Silverdale yesterday, probably hoping for a cut of the reward. Jacob's jaw tightened. Rebecca and the others are in town. If Dawson knows about them, your housekeeper? Drake raised an eyebrow. The one who chose to stand with you against armed bounty hunters. She's more than that, Jacob replied quietly, the admission surprising even himself. Drake studied him for a moment, understanding dawning in his eyes. Well, this complicates things. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. We need to get you to Helena for the deposition, but first we need to extract your people from Broken Pine. I won't leave them behind, Jacob stated firmly. Didn't expect you would. Drake checked his pocket watch. Here's what we'll do. I'll ride into town openly. Federal marshals still command some respect, even in backwaters like Broken Pine. I'll locate your people, assess the situation, and then we create a diversion to get them out safely. Tonight, if possible. Drake fixed Jacob with a stern look. But you stay hidden until I come back. If Williams' men spot you, or if Dawson gets his hands on you, that writ won't matter. You'll be dead before I can intervene. Jacob wanted to protest, to insist on accompanying Drake into town, but logic overcame emotion. His presence would only endanger Rebecca and the others further. We'll make camp in the old mining cabin on Sawyer's Ridge, he decided. It's abandoned, but still sound. Good defensive position if needed. Drake nodded approval. I'll find you there after sundown. He hesitated, then added, if things go sideways, get yourself to Helena. The U.S. attorney will protect you there until the trial. Not without Rebecca, Jacob replied, the steel in his voice making it clear this point was non-negotiable. The marshal sighed. You Thorns always did lead with your hearts. That's what got you into this mess in the first place. He touched the brim of his hat in a casual salute. Keep your head down, James. We're too close to lose now. As Drake rode toward Broken Pine, Jacob and Luis made their way to the abandoned mining cabin, a small, sturdy structure built into the side of the ridge, offering a clear view of the surrounding area while remaining largely hidden from below. They tended to their horses, gathered firewood, and prepared the cabin for defense, working in the efficient silence of men accustomed to each other's rhythm. It was only when they had done all they could that Jacob allowed himself to sit, his back against the cabin wall, exhaustion washing over him in a wave. Luis handed him a strip of jerky from their meager supplies, then stepped outside to keep watch, understanding his employer's need for solitude. Alone, Jacob removed the daguerreotype from his shirt pocket, the only personal item he had grabbed besides the wooden box. It showed Mary on their wedding day, her smile gentle, her eyes filled with hope for their future together. He had carried it as a talisman of grief, a reminder of all he had lost. Now, tracing the outline of her face with his thumb, Jacob felt something shift within him. The ache of Mary's loss remained, but alongside it grew something new, the image of Rebecca standing in the kitchen doorway, rifle in hand, choosing to stay when she could have fled. Rebecca reading to him in the evenings from one of his books of poetry, her voice giving new life to familiar verses. Rebecca in his arms as the ranch house burned around them, her heart beating steadily against his chest. You would have liked her, he whispered to Mary's image. She has your courage. A sudden commotion outside pulled Jacob from his reverie. He tucked the daguerreotype away and grabbed his rifle, moving swiftly to the door where Luis stood tense and alert. Riders, the ranch hand reported, pointing to a dust cloud on the horizon, coming fast from the direction of Broken Pine. Jacob raised his spyglass, his breath catching as he recognized the lead rider. It's Rebecca. She rode a bay mare he didn't recognize, her hair coming loose from its pins, her dress fluttering in the wind of her passage. Behind her came Marshal Drake, and to Jacob's surprise, Emmett, his injured arm bound in a proper sling but his seat in the saddle steady. Jacob rushed down the slope to meet them, relief and concern warring within him. Rebecca spotted him and urged her horse faster, covering the remaining distance in a gallop. She reined in sharply before him, dismounting in a fluid motion that spoke of urgency rather than joy. They found us, she said without preamble, her face flushed with exertion and fear. Williams' men. They took my mother and old Pete hostage. Jacob's blood ran cold. When? An hour ago, Drake answered, dismounting more carefully. 6 men, well armed. They're holding them at the sheriff's office. Dawson's cooperating fully. They're demanding you in exchange, Rebecca added, her eyes meeting Jacob. By sundown, or they start shooting hostages. Jacob's mind raced, calculating distances, assessing options. Where's Leas? Here, patron, the ranch hand answered, emerging from cover above. We need more men, Jacob decided. Lise, ride to the Carson Ranch. Tell George what's happening. He owes me for saving his herd during the blizzard last winter. Lise nodded and mounted swiftly, spurring his horse toward the neighboring ranch without further instruction. That still leaves us outnumbered, Drake pointed out. Not necessarily, Emmett interjected, speaking for the first time. The miners from the Blue Creek operation, They're in town for supplies. Most worked for you back in Colorado, Mr. Thomas. They haven't forgotten who stood up for them against Williams. Hope flickered in Jacob's chest. How many? 8, maybe 10. Solid men, all armed. Jacob turned to Drake. Can you reach them without alerting Dawson or the bounty hunters? The marshal nodded thoughtfully. The miners' camp is on the outskirts of town. I can approach from the east. Stay out of sight. Do it, Jacob decided. Tell them I need their help. Tell them Williams is involved. As Drake prepared to leave, Rebecca moved closer to Jacob, her hand finding his. They said they'd kill my mother first, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Because of me, because I helped you. Jacob's fingers tightened around hers. I won't let that happen. I know, she replied, her faith in him both humbling and terrifying. That's why I came to you instead of surrendering the documents they wanted. Jacob looked at her sharply. The wooden box? You have it? Rebecca nodded. Hidden. They searched Mother's cabin but didn't find it. Relief surged through him. Without those documents, their case against Williams would be significantly weakened. With them, even if Jacob didn't survive to testify, the evidence might speak for itself. Good, he said. Now we need to plan how to get your mother and Pete out alive. He turned to Emmett. Tell me everything you remember about the sheriff's office. Every door, every window, every possible approach. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jacob Thorne prepared for what might be his final confrontation with the past he had tried so hard to outrun. But this time he wasn't fighting just for himself or for justice. This time he was fighting for a future he had only recently allowed himself to imagine, a future with Rebecca Mason by his side. Dusk settled over Broken Pine, the fading light casting long shadows across the town's single main street. The sheriff's office's squat, weathered building with barred windows and a small attached jail cell stood illuminated by oil lamps, the only structure showing signs of activity as night approached. 2 armed men lounged on the porch, rifles across their knees, while occasional movements behind the windows suggested more men inside. From his position on the roof of the Mercantile across the street, Jacob studied the building through his spyglass, memorizing the positions of guards, the timing of their movements, any potential weakness in their defenses. Drake crouched beside him, equally intent on the scene below. I count 8 men total, the marshal murmured. 2 outside, at least 5 inside, plus Dawson. Jacob nodded agreement. Any sign of the hostages? Back room, most likely. That's where Dawson keeps his strongbox and files. Drake shifted position carefully. Your miners are in place. Carson sent 4 of his ranch hands with Luis. They're waiting for your signal. Jacob lowered the spyglass, considering. Their plan was risky, perhaps foolhardy, but with Eleanor Mason and old Pete's lives at stake, they had little choice. The miners from Colorado, men who had once worked Jacob's silver claim and knew him as James Thomas, had rallied without hesitation when Drake explained the situation. Their loyalty, even after 2 years, both surprised and humbled Jacob. And Rebecca? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Drake's expression tightened with disapproval. Exactly where you told her not to be, with the Carson boys, ready to move in from the east. Jacob sighed, frustrated but not surprised. Rebecca had argued fiercely against being left behind, her determination to participate in her mother's rescue unshakable. He had relented only when Drake pointed out that having her visible during the operation might actually keep the bounty hunters from shooting immediately, knowing she was the leverage that had brought Jacob this far. Time to move, Jacob decided, checking that his revolver was fully loaded. Signaled Weiss to start the diversion. Drake struck a match, using it to light a small lantern that he raised 3 times in quick succession. From the shadows near the livery stable came an answering flash of light. Moments later, the night erupted in chaos as a wagon loaded with barrels of coal oil crashed into the water trough at the far end of the street, the resulting explosion sending a fireball into the sky. The reaction was immediate. The guards on the porch leapt to their feet, attention drawn to the conflagration. Shouts echoed from inside the sheriff's office as men rushed to investigate the disturbance. Now, Jacob urged, and they descended swiftly via the ladder they had positioned earlier, crossing to the alley behind the sheriff's office while attention was focused elsewhere. They found the back door guarded by a single man who was craning his neck to see the fire. Drake approached openly, badge displayed. Federal Marshal, he announced. Sheriff Dawson requested assistance with the fire. The guard hesitated, uncertain, and in that moment of indecision, Jacob struck from the shadows. A swift blow to the head with his rifle butt, and the man crumpled silently to the ground. Drake bound and gagged the unconscious guard while Jacob tested the door. Locked, as expected. He knelt, examining the mechanism by the dim light filtering from the window. Can you pick it? Drake whispered. Jacob withdrew a slender metal tool from his boot. Mary taught me. Said every wife should ensure her husband could rescue her if needed. A sad smile touched his lips at the memory. The lock yielded after a tense minute of careful manipulation. Jacob eased the door open, revealing a narrow hallway lit by a single lamp. At the far end, voices drifted from the front office, fewer than before, suggesting some men had indeed gone to investigate the fire. They moved silently down the corridor until they reached a closed door. Jacob pressed his ear against it, catching the faint sound of labored breathing. Old Pete, perhaps in a woman's voice murmuring reassurances. Eleanor Mason, alive and apparently unharmed. Drake positioned himself to cover the hallway leading to the front office, while Jacob prepared to enter the room. Just as he reached for the handle, the main door of the sheriff's office banged open, followed by a commotion of bootsteps and angry voices. "It's a diversion," a man shouted. "Dawson," Jacob recognized. "Check the prisoners." Heavy footsteps approached rapidly. Jacob abandoned stealth for speed, throwing the door open and rushing inside, gun raised. Eleanor Mason sat on a wooden chair, her hands bound before her, while old Pete lay on a cot against the wall, his bandaged chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. A single guard stood between them, his revolver already drawn and swinging toward Jacob. 3 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Jacob felt the burn of a bullet grazing his shoulder, but his own aim was true. The guard staggered backward, his gun clattering to the floor as his hands clutched at his chest. Behind Jacob, a thud and groan suggested Drake had encountered resistance in the hallway. "Mrs. Mason," Jacob acknowledged as he quickly cut her bonds. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing lasting," Eleanor replied with remarkable composure, rubbing her wrists. "But Pete needs a doctor urgently." They reopened his wound during questioning. Jacob moved to the injured man, alarmed by his pallor. Pete's eyes fluttered open, recognition dawning as he focused on Jacob. "Knew you'd come, patron," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Save your strength," Jacob advised, checking the bandage, which was indeed soaked with fresh blood. "We're getting you out of here." Drake appeared in the doorway, a cut above his eye, but otherwise unharmed. 2 more down, but Dawson and at least 3 others are still in the front office. They know something's wrong. As if to confirm his words, a voice called from the front of the building. "Thorne, or Thomas, or whatever your real name is. We know you're back there. Come out now, or we start shooting through the door." "We need another way out," Jacob muttered, scanning the room. A small window, barred but possibly large enough for Eleanor to squeeze through, offered their only alternative. A thunderous crash from the front of the building interrupted his thoughts. Gunfire erupted, accompanied by shouts and the sound of breaking glass. Through the commotion, Jacob recognized Luce's voice calling orders in rapid Spanish. The diversion worked, Drake observed with grim satisfaction. "Your men are hitting them from the front." Jacob moved to the window, peering out to see Rebecca and 2 of Carson's ranch hands approaching cautiously from the shadows, rifles ready. Relief surged through him at the sight of her, unharmed and determined. "Here," he called softly, drawing her attention. Rebecca rushed to the window, her face lighting with emotion as she saw him. "Jacob, Mother," her eyes swept the room, assessing. "Is everyone all right?" "Pete's in bad shape," Jacob replied. "We need to get him out now." Rebecca nodded, already working on the window bars with a crowbar she had brought. The miners created a second diversion, set fire to the hayloft in the livery. Most of the bounty hunters ran to help contain it. The bars came loose after several minutes of concentrated effort. Jacob lifted Eleanor toward the opening where Rebecca and the ranch hands helped her through. Old Pete would be more challenging. The window was narrow, and moving him risked worsening his injuries. "We'll have to go out the front," Jacob decided, hearing the gunfight in the main office beginning to subside. "Drake, check if it's clear." The marshal edged down the hallway, returning moments later with a nod. "Our people have control of the front room. 3 bounty hunters down, 2 captured. Dawson is wounded but alive." With extreme care, Jacob and Drake carried old Pete between them, navigating the hallway to the main office where Luis and the miners had secured the room. The bodies of bounty hunters lay sprawled across the floor, while Sheriff Dawson sat slumped against his desk, clutching a bloodied arm, his face contorted with pain and fury. "You're finished," Thomas Dawson spat as they passed. "Williams will send more men, better men." Jacob paused, shifting Pete's weight to meet the sheriff's gaze. "Williams is the one who's finished. The federal indictments are already filed. Indictments can disappear," Dawson sneered. "Men like Williams don't answer to the law. They own it." Drake stepped forward, his badge glinting in the lamplight. "Not this time." He produced a pair of handcuffs. "Sheriff Dawson, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and attempted murder of a federal witness." As Drake secured the protesting sheriff, Jacob and Luis continued outside with Pete, where Rebecca waited with a wagon commandeered for the injured man. Eleanor sat in the back already, a blanket around her shoulders, her face pale but composed. "The fire at the livery is spreading," Rebecca reported as they carefully loaded Pete into the wagon. "The whole town will be focused on containing it." Jacob nodded, surveying the scene. The street was eerily empty, townsfolk either asleep or drawn to the spectacle of the burning stable. Smoke billowed against the night sky, casting an orange glow over the buildings. "We need to move quickly," he decided. "Get Pete and your mother to Doc Sullivan, then meet at the rendezvous point outside town. Drake will escort the prisoners to Helena." Rebecca caught his arm as he turned to coordinate with the miners. "And you? Where will you go?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken fears and hopes. Jacob covered her hand with his, acutely aware that they stood on the precipice of an uncertain future. "I have to testify in Helena," he replied softly, "to end this once and for all." And then she pressed, her eyes searching his. Before he could answer, a gunshot cracked through the night. Jacob felt the impact before he heard Rebecca's scream, a burning sensation spreading across his side as he staggered back. Through the haze of sudden pain, he saw a figure on the roof of the building opposite, a rifle glinting in the firelight. "Sniper!" Louis shouted, returning fire as chaos erupted once more. Jacob found himself on the ground, Rebecca kneeling beside him, her hands pressing against his wound. Her lips moved, but he couldn't make out the words over the ringing in his ears and the renewed gunfire around them. As darkness crept into the edges of his vision. Jacob's last coherent thought was that he still hadn't answered her question, hadn't told her where he would go when this was all over. Home, he wanted to say, wherever you are. Jacob drifted through layers of consciousness, sometimes aware of hushed voices and gentle hands, other times lost in fevered dreams where wanted posters bearing his face fluttered like autumn leaves, and Mary's voice whispered warnings he couldn't quite understand. The pain in his side flared and receded in waves, a burning reminder that he was still alive despite the sniper's best efforts. When he finally opened his eyes with full awareness, sunlight was streaming through unfamiliar curtains. He lay in a clean bed, bandages wrapped tightly around his torso. The room was small but tidy, with simple furnishings and a vase of wildflowers on the bedside table. Not Doc Sullivan's surgery, then. Somewhere else. "Welcome back," said a quiet voice. Jacob turned his head to find Rebecca sitting in a chair beside the bed, a book open in her lap. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hair was loosely braided over one shoulder, but her smile at seeing him awake transformed her tired face. "How long?" he managed, his voice a dry rasp. Rebecca set aside her book, reaching for a cup of water. "3 days," she answered, helping him drink. "The bullet went clean through, but you lost a lot of blood. Doc Sullivan wasn't sure you'd make it through the first night." Jacob sank back against the pillows, memories returning in fragments. "The sniper." "Louis got him," Rebecca replied, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. "One of William's men, according to papers we found on him. He had another copy of your wanted poster with notes about your movements. The others? Your mother, Pete?" "Mother's fine, just bruises and exhaustion. She's been helping me tend to you." Rebecca's expression sobered. "Pete didn't make it. The wound was too severe, and the rough handling by William's men sealed his fate. He passed the night after the rescue, never regaining consciousness." Grief knotted in Jacob's chest. Old Pete had been with him since the beginning of his time in Montana, loyal and steadfast. Another good man lost to William's greed and vindictiveness. "We buried him on the hill overlooking what's left of the ranch," Rebecca continued softly. "Lee said he would have wanted that to rest where he could keep an eye on the cattle." Jacob closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a moment to mourn before practicality reasserted itself. "Where are we?" "Not in town. Carson's ranch," Rebecca confirmed. "George insisted we bring you here after the shooting. It was too dangerous to stay in Broken Pine with William's men still lurking about. Luis and Emmett are here too, along with my mother." The miners returned to their camp, but promised to come if needed. "And Drake?" "Left for Helena yesterday with the prisoners and evidence. He's preparing for the trial." Rebecca adjusted his blanket unnecessarily, her fingers lingering near his hand. "The U.S. attorney has scheduled your testimony for 2 weeks from now, assuming you're well enough to travel by then." 2 weeks. Jacob assessed his condition with the pragmatic eye of a man accustomed to injuries. The wound was serious but not mortal. With proper care and rest, he should be able to make the journey to Helena. "I'll be ready," he stated with more confidence than he felt. Rebecca studied him with a knowing look. "Perhaps, but you'll follow Doc Sullivan's orders until then. No arguments." There was a new authority in her voice, a firmness that hadn't been there before. Jacob found himself smiling despite the pain and circumstances. "Yes, ma'am." A shadow crossed her face. "I thought I'd lost you," she admitted, her composure cracking slightly. "When you fell, there was so much blood, and all I could think was that you never answered my question." Jacob reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. "Ask me again. Where will you go? After the testimony, after Williams is brought to justice. Will you remain Jacob Thorne or return to being James Thomas?" The question carried implications beyond mere identity. It was about his future, about who he would choose to be when the past no longer defined him. Jacob considered carefully before answering. "Neither. Perhaps," he said finally. "James Thomas died when Mary did, in many ways, and Jacob Thorne was born of necessity, not choice." He tightened his grip on her hand. "I think when this is over, I might become someone new entirely, someone who looks forward more than back." Rebecca's eyes searched his. "And where would this new man make his home?" "Wherever you are," Jacob replied simply, the admission both terrifying and liberating. "If you'll have me." The breath she had been holding released in a soft sigh. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against their joined hand. "I thought I'd never love again after Daniel," she whispered. "I was so certain that part of me had died with him, and now—" Rebecca raised her head, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Now I know better. The heart rebuilds even from ashes." She touched his cheek gently. "Yes, I'll have you. Whatever name you choose, whatever life we build." The door opened before Jacob could respond, admitting Eleanor Mason carrying a tray of food. She stopped short at the tableau before her, a knowing smile touching her lip. "I see our patient is awake," she observed, setting the tray on the bedside table, "and apparently receiving more than medical attention." Rebecca flushed, but didn't withdraw her hand from Jacob's. "Mother ... single quotes." Eleanor waved away her daughter's embarrassment. "Don't mind me. I was young once too, believe it or not." She fixed Jacob with a shrewd look. "Though I do expect proper intentions from a man who's caused my daughter to risk her life multiple times in a single week. The most honorable intentions." "Mrs. Mason," Jacob assured her, surprising himself with the ease of the promise. "As soon as I'm able to stand without assistance." "Good." Eleanor nodded, satisfied. "Now eat your broth before it gets cold. You'll need your strength for the journey to Helena." After she left, Rebecca laughed softly. "I believe you've just been given conditional approval." "So it seems," Jacob agreed, attempting to sit up further. Rebecca helped, adjusting pillows behind him before handing him the bowl of broth. As he ate, she filled him in on events since the shooting. Marshal Drake had taken Dawson and the captured bounty hunters to the territorial capital under heavy guard. The federal prosecutor was building his case against Williams, with Jacob's testimony as the centerpiece. The wooden box containing the evidence had been safely delivered to the U.S. Attorney's office. And Williams? Jacob asked. Any word? Rebecca's expression darkened. Drake received a telegram yesterday. Williams has fled Colorado, reportedly heading north. They think he might try to reach Canada before the indictments are served. Or he might try to silence me one last time, Jacob noted grimly. We should assume he knows I survived the sniper and will be testifying. Carson has men patrolling the property, Rebecca assured him. And Louise hasn't left her door except to eat and sleep. She nodded toward the window where, now that Jacob looked, he could see the shadow of someone standing guard outside. Even so, we'll need to be careful on the journey to Helena, Jacob cautioned. Williams is desperate now, which makes him more dangerous than ever. The following days passed in a rhythm of recovery and preparation. Jacob's strength returned gradually, first sitting up without assistance, then standing, then taking short walks around the Carson ranch house. Doc Sullivan visited every other day, grudgingly approving of his patient's progress while warning against overexertion. Rebecca rarely left his side, reading to him during long afternoons and discussing plans for the future during quiet evening. They spoke of rebuilding the ranch, perhaps in a new location farther from Broken Pine, of the life they might create together after the shadow of Williams no longer hung over them. 1 week after the shooting, a telegram arrived from Marshal Drake. Williams spotted near Montana border, believed armed and traveling with hired guns. Exercise extreme caution. That night, Jacob sat with George Carson, Louise, and Emmett around the dining table, maps spread before them as they planned the journey to Helena. The main road is too exposed, Carson argued, tracing the route with his finger. Williams will have men watching it. The mountain pass is safer but slower, Louise countered. And the patron is still recovering. Jacob studied the options, conscious of Rebecca listening from her position by the fireplace. We'll take the mountain route, he decided. Better defensible positions if we're ambushed. Carson nodded agreement. I'll send 8 men with good shots. All of them. When do we leave? Emmett asked, his broken arm now healing in a proper cast. Jacob calculated distances and timing. Day after tomorrow. We'll need to reach Helena by the 5th-10th to prepare for the testimony. He looked up at Rebecca. Are you certain you want to come? It will be dangerous. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. I've read that wanted poster so many times I could recite it from memory. I've fought beside you, patched your wounds, chosen your cause as my own. She smiled slightly. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't tear those stitches before you reach the witness stand. That night, as moonlight spilled through the bedroom window, Jacob lay awake thinking of all that had transpired since Rebecca Mason had first walked into his life, how she had discovered his secret, confronted him with the wanted poster that might have meant his death, and then chosen to believe in his innocence when she could have turned him in for the reward. He thought of old Pete, loyal to the end, and of Mary, whose memory no longer ached like an open wound but had softened into something he could carry without pain. He thought of Williams, whose greed and corruption had cost so many lives, and of the justice that might finally be within reach. Most of all, he thought of the future stretching before him, uncertain perhaps, but no longer empty, no longer defined solely by what he was running from, but by what he was running toward. 2 days later, as dawn broke over the eastern mountains, Jacob mounted his horse with only a slight wince. Rebecca rode beside him, her mother behind her, while Louise and Emmett flanked them protectively. Carson's men formed a perimeter around the small party, rifles ready and eyes alert. To Helena, Jacob said, spurring his horse forward. And an end to this. As they rode away from the Carson ranch, folded paper fell from Jacob's saddlebag, one of the wanted posters that had pursued him for so long. It fluttered briefly in the morning breeze before settling into the dust of the trail, forgotten and irrelevant to the man who now rode toward his future rather than away from his past. The journey to Helena took 4 grueling days through mountain passes and remote trails. Jacob's wound troubled him less than expected, though Rebecca insisted on checking his bandages each evening when they made camp. The larger party provided safety but slowed their progress. Eleanor Mason was unused to long days in the saddle, and several of Carson's men were more accustomed to working cattle than traversing mountain terrain. They encountered no sign of Williams or his hired guns, though the constant vigilance wore on them all. Each snapping twig, each distant rider glimpsed through trees, brought an immediate response. Rifles raised, positions secured, nerves stretched taut until the threat proved imaginary. On the 4th day, the territorial capital came into view, a sprawling settlement nestled in a valley, its government buildings rising prominently above the surrounding structures. Marshal Drake met them at the edge of town, his expression grim as he led them through side streets to a nondescript boarding house where rooms had been secured. Williams arrived yesterday, he informed them as they settled in the private parlor, away from curious ears. He's staying at the Helena Grand Hotel, playing the role of the respected businessman come to clear his name of baseless accusation. Jacob's jaw tightened. Does he know I'm here to testify? He knows, Drake confirmed. His lawyer has filed motions to exclude your testimony, claiming you're a fugitive with a vendetta against his client. The marshal's mouth quirked in a satisfied smile. The federal judge denied them all. You're scheduled to appear tomorrow morning. Rebecca, who had been helping her mother settle into their shared room, returned in time to hear this. Is it safe? Williams must be desperate by now. We have men watching the hotel, Drake assured her, and this boarding house is under constant guard. Still, he added, fixing Jacob with a pointed look, I wouldn't recommend any solitary strolls before the hearing. That evening, after a simple meal brought to their room, Jacob stood at the window watching the street below. Helena bustled with activity even as darkness fell, miners, traders, and government officials mixing with the usual assortment of opportunists drawn to a growing settlement. Somewhere out there, Edward Williams S.R. was making his final plan, perhaps even now dispatching men to prevent Jacob's testimony. A soft knock at the connecting door preceded Rebecca's entrance. She had changed from her travel-stained clothes into a modest blue dress, her hair freshly pinned, though fatigue still shadowed her eyes. Mother's asleep, she said, moving to stand beside him at the window. The journey was hard on her, though she'd never admit it. Jacob nodded, acutely aware of her presence, of the faint lavender scent that somehow persisted, despite days on the trail. Drake thinks Williams might make one last attempt tonight, he said, before the hearing. Rebecca's hand found his, fingers intertwining with practiced ease. Then we'll be ready. They stood together in comfortable silence until a movement in the street below caught Jacob's attention. A man in a fine coat, walking with purpose despite the late hour, his face briefly illuminated by a street lamp. Williams, Jacob breathed, recognizing the imperious bearing, the carefully trimmed beard streaked with silver. He's here. Single quotes. Rebecca tensed beside him. Should we alert Drake? Before Jacob could respond, Williams stopped directly across from the boarding house, looking up at the windows as if he knew exactly where to find them. Even from a distance, the cold calculation in his gaze was evident. He made no threatening gesture, no overt move to approach the building. Instead, he simply tipped his hat in a mocking salute before continuing down the street. He's sending a message, Jacob realized, letting me know he's found us. A message of intimidation, Rebecca agreed, her voice steady despite the implicit threat. He wants you afraid tomorrow, wants you to run. Jacob turned from the window, drawing Rebecca with him. I'm done running, he said with quiet conviction. It ends tomorrow one way or another. Morning arrived with pale sunshine and a crisp autumn breeze. Jacob dressed with care in clothes provided by the U.S. Attorney's Office, a proper suit that reminded him of his life in Colorado, though the man who wore it now was fundamentally changed. Rebecca helped him with his tie, her fingers deft and sure. You look like yourself again, she observed, smoothing Pell, or perhaps a new version of yourself. James Thomas with Jacob Thorne's wisdom, he suggested with a faint smile. And scars, she added, touching his side gently where the bandages remained. Drake arrived to escort them to the courthouse, 2 deputies accompanying him as additional security. The streets were busy with morning traffic, making it impossible to identify potential threats among the crowds. Jacob kept Rebecca close beside him, his hand at the small of her back, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The territorial courthouse stood imposing on a corner lot, its stone steps leading to heavy oak doors flanked by uniformed guards. Inside, the main courtroom buzzed with spectators, journalists, government officials, and curious citizens drawn by rumors of corruption and violence. Jacob spotted Williams immediately, seated at the defense table with 2 expensively dressed lawyers. The businessman's composed facade faltered momentarily when he saw Jacob, a flash of hatred quickly concealed behind a mask of injured dignity. The U.S. attorney, a sharp-featured man named Harrison, greeted them in a side chamber. You'll be our key witness, he explained to Jacob. The documents you provided establish motive and pattern, but your first-hand testimony about Edward Williams Jr.'s death is crucial. When the bailiff called the court to order, Jacob took his place in the witness box, hand raised to swear his oath. From the gallery, Rebecca watched, her presence a silent affirmation of faith. Eleanor sat beside her, straight-backed and resolute, while Luis and Emmett occupied positions near the doors, alert for any disturbance. For 2 hours, Jacob testified, steadily recounting his discovery of the Williams family's corruption, the confrontation that led to Edward Jr.'s death, the subsequent framing, and his flight from Colorado. He described the evidence in detail, connecting documents to specific instances of fraud and intimidation. Throughout, Williams glared from the defense table, his composure gradually crumbling as the weight of evidence mounted. When Harrison presented the original wanted poster, the very one Rebecca had found in Jacob's bedroom as evidence of Williams' campaign of persecution, a murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge examined it carefully before passing it to the clerk to be entered into the record. This poster, Harrison emphasized to the court, represents not justice but its perversion, a tool wielded by a powerful man to silence the truth. During cross-examination, Williams' lawyers tried to portray Jacob as a murderer seeking revenge, but the contradictions in their arguments only highlighted the weakness of their position. By midday, when the judge called a recess, the tide had clearly turned against Williams. In the courthouse corridor, Drake approached with news. Williams's men are deserting him, he reported with satisfaction. Two turned themselves in an hour ago, offering testimony in exchange for leniency. Rebecca squeezed Jacob's hand. It's working. You're winning. Before Jacob could respond, a commotion erupted at the far end of the hallway. Williams burst through a knot of people, his face contorted with fury, a small derringer clutched in his shaking hand. Thomas! He shouted, raising the gun. You've taken everything from me. Time seemed to slow. Jacob pushed Rebecca behind him even as Drake reached for his sidearm. Before either man could act, a single shot rang out. Williams staggered, the derringer falling from his grasp as crimson bloomed across his expensive waistcoat. He collapsed to his knees, eyes wide with shock. Behind him stood Eleanor Mason, a small pistol still raised in her steady hand. That, she said with remarkable composure, was for my daughter, for the man she loves. In the chaos that followed, deputies securing William, who would survive to face justice, though never again as a free man. Drake questioning Eleanor, who was swiftly cleared of wrongdoing on grounds of defense of others. Reporters clamoring for statements. Jacob held Rebecca close, the reality of their survival slowly settling over them. It's over, he whispered against her hair. Truly over. 1 month later, as the first snow dusted the mountains, Jacob stood with Rebecca on a ridge overlooking a valley where a new ranch house was taking shape. The federal government, in recognition of his role in exposing Williams' corruption, had granted him land and compensation, not enough to replace all that was lost, but sufficient to begin again. What shall we call it? Rebecca asked, her arm linked through his as they surveyed the construction. In the valley below, Luis directed workers placing roof beams while Emmett, his arm healing well, organized supplies. Jacob considered for a moment. How about Truce Haven? He suggested. Since truth is what brought us here. Rebecca smiled, leaning into his warmth. Truth and a wanted poster I happen to be able to read. He laughed, the sound free and unburdened. That too. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. Speaking of truth, I believe I made a promise to your mother about honorable intentions. You did, Rebecca agreed, her eyes bright with anticipation. Jacob sank to one knee in the fresh snow, still holding her hands. Rebecca Mason, will you marry me? Not because I need a housekeeper, but because I need you. Your courage. Your faith, your love. Yes, she answered without hesitation. Though I expect to be much more than a housekeeper, Mr. Thorne. I wouldn't have it any other way, Mrs. Thorne-Tooby. As they sealed their promise with a kiss. The wanted poster that had once threatened Jacob's life was being preserved in the territorial archives, evidence in a closed case. A relic of justice perverted and then restored. And the unlikely beginning of a love story that would be told in their family for generations to come. Far below, the new house waited to be filled with light and laughter, with children and grandchildren, with years of memories yet to be made. A home built not on secrets and fear, but on truth and trust. A haven at last for two people who had found each other amid danger and deception, and chosen to face the future together. Wanted posters, bounty hunters and all.